if we have it that two angles in one triangle are congruent to two angles in another triangle, then the third angles in the triangle are congruent. So in this case, we have it that we have two angles in this triangle congruent to two angles in this triangle. The theorem implies then that angle F is congruent to angle C. We're going to prove this now. So let's write the given. What we have here, we have angle A is congruent to angle D, and then I have angle B is congruent to angle E, and that's given. Now the next thing that we need to refer to is we need to refer to the triangle sum theorem. We know for any triangle that the sum of the measures of its angles is 180. So I know in this triangle here, I know that measure of A plus measure of B plus measure of C has to be 180. Now I also know the same is true in this triangle, that I must have the measure of D plus the measure of E plus the measure of F equal to 180. And this follows from the triangle sum theorem. Now, my next statement, I forgot to do something, but it's okay. We'll do it after, actually. We can do this all out of order. It's okay. So, what do I mean out of order? Okay, but let's see, because I forgot to write something after me stating that these angles were congruent. That's going to come into play here. It seems like a redundant step, but we'll see. So, I have the measure of A plus the measure of B plus the measure of C is equal to 180, and I also have the measure of D plus the measure of E plus the measure of F is equal to 180. That means that this here is equal to this here. So I just set them equal to each other, and that's substitution. So the measure of A plus the measure of B plus the measure of C is equal to 180, but also what's equal to 180 is the measure of D equal to the measure of D plus the measure of E and plus the measure of F. And that's just substitution. Okay, now 4. I think at this point I have to state something that I forgot to state. It should have really been step 2, but it doesn't matter. The angle A is congruent to angle D, and angle B is congruent to angle E. Two angles are equal. Two angles are congruent. It means that their measures are equal. That's the definition of congruent angles. So from this, I have to write that the measure of angle A equals the measure of angle D, and that the measure of angle B equals the measure of angle E. And this is definition of congruent angles. Okay, now 5. If you look at the equation in 3 and I subtract, let's say I subtract the measure of A on both sides. So let's see what happens. Minus measure of A minus the measure of A on both sides. Well, here I get 0 clearly. The measure of A minus the measure of A is 0. Now the measure of D is the same value. Look, the measure of D equals the measure of A. So this also equals 0. And if I minus the measure of B on both sides here, I'm minusing the measure of B over here, that's going to be 0. And I'm going to measure the measure of angle B over here. And if you see this, look, B is the same value as E. The measure of angle B is the same value as the measure of angle E. So when I subtract, this is also going to be 0. And I'm going to get a resulting equation. What's left is that the measure of angle C equals the measure of angle F. And that's what I write for step 5. I write measure of angle C equals measure of angle F. And this follows from the subtraction property of equality. Okay, and you could just write subtraction. 6. You're not done because you need to do, again, a seemingly redundant thing. You need to say if the measure of two angles are equal, then they are congruent. So here I have the measure of two angles being equal. That means that angle C is congruent to angle F. And this is definition of congruent angles. And now you show that the third angle, this third angle, is congruent to this angle, this third angle. The third angles are congruent.